understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How you doing there? It is time for the podcast, and today we have something a little bit different, maybe a respite from the relentless, inchoate news flow which has been spewed at us from various different platforms. John, I know your head is melted with all this economic, political, geostrategic world that's changing by the millisecond.
Yes, it is. It is. And actually, talking of respites, do you know where I was yesterday?
Where were you yesterday?
I walked into a hotel in Newtown, Mount Kennedy in County Wicklow, because my little nephew was taking part. In fact, he'd organised this speedcubing competition.
Speedcubing, it sounds almost autoerotic, John, so go on.
He's 9 now, so take it easy.
Okay, fair enough. Take that back.
It was amazing because it was like walking into a completely parallel universe. The place was packed with young people, teenagers.
What is speed cubing?
It's puzzle solving. It's Rubik's cubes. You know the Rubik's cubes. So it's competition in Rubik's cubes, and you do it in there's loads of different types. There's the regular Rubik's cubes, and there's 3x3s and 6x6, and there's triangle ones or pyramid ones.
God.
And they do a blindfold as well. There's another blindfold.
Really?
But what I loved about it, now Oisín came second in the whole competition, so fair play to Oisín.
Fair play to him. Fair play to Oisín.
But this was a completely different world, as I was saying. And actually, it's really big, not just in Ireland, but all over the world.
I remember those things from the 80s.
But actually, Mac, what really struck me about it was a really vibrant community, like genuinely full of joy and camaraderie and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But also, I think we forget that sometimes there's more important things going on in the world. Apart from interest rates and tariffs and Trump, we forget that life goes on.
Yeah.
And we get too wrapped up in the news flow, as you say. So this was an amazing respite.
Well, I think you're right. I think it's kind of like Stockholm Syndrome. We're kind of captured by the madness that's out there and the relentless news flow that feeds into economics, feeds into politics, feeds into commerce, then changes the worldview.
Yeah.
And as you're saying, there's loads of other areas where people say, well, you know what? I don't care.
Yeah,
Life goes on.
exactly.
And in fact, John, this is what we're going to focus on today. We're going to focus on storytelling and literature, and how literature obviously also, it's probably against the background of having put the book festival together and it's been on sale and what have you. You kind of go into also a sort of a parallel world, the world of the novelist, the world of the storyteller, the world of the imagination, the world of fiction, which is, again, a different form of respite from the universe, the non-fiction universe, the news flow universe, the economics, the commercial universe, which is relentlessly, it's just kind of exhausting. Right? It's exhausting.
Yes, it is.
It is exhausting. So with that in mind, John, we are now going to the world of the storyteller. And we're going to talk to the brilliant Elif Shafak, Turkish, now with British citizenship, novelist. She's a novelist. She's an essayist. She's a public speaker. She's also a political scientist and an activist.
Yeah.
She's published 21 books, many of which I have read many years ago. The one, 40 Rules of Love, was the first book I read by her. It's amazing. I've just finished another book by her called There Are Rivers in the Sky. She's been described by the Financial Times as Turkey's leading female novelist. She is a bestseller across many, many continents. Her work has been translated into 57 languages, right?
She's a beautiful writer.
Nominated for all sorts of literary awards. So she's the real deal. She's the real deal. And she's somebody I've known for a long, long time. She's coming to Dalkey. And I just thought today, she's from Turkey. The last book was about the Middle East. She's very involved in the world. But she also accords what you're talking about there, John, which is a little bit of respite. Looking at fiction, looking at the power of the imagination, and a little bit of respite from the news flow.
But also, Mike, it offers more clarity to the world of Trump, et cetera, by giving us kind of another perspective, another angle on things that helps us to understand the world that we live in.
Well, what I'd like to think is this economics podcast doesn't just bring you the hard numbers, John, and the sort of slightly unidimensional world of economics, but we go on to economics as culture. Economics is what do we say at the start? If you want to understand the economy, you got to understand human nature, and part of human
Exactly.
nature is
Exactly.
storytelling, and part of human nature is the power of the imagination. So let us throw our economic cloak wildly, John, around all sorts of various. We're going to go Tales of Gilgamesh, a 3,000-year-old saga. We're going to be all over the place, John. Let us go and talk to Elif, who is on the line right now. Now we have a really special conversation that I am sure you will enjoy thoroughly. It is with the amazing Turkish stroke British now novelist Elif Shafak. Elif has been a friend for many years. She has been a Dalkey recidivist. She is coming back to Dalkey this June. We cannot wait. I know she has many fans in Ireland. And Elif, it is brilliant to see you. How are you?
Oh, it's so lovely to see you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
No, it'll be really wonderful. Now, about 4 days ago, I finished your latest amazing novel called There Are Rivers in the Sky. And I want to talk to you about that. But I wanted to actually put the whole story in the context. In that book, you have stories of power, dispossession, of big questions like who owns history, who gets to tell the story of history, minority oppression in the Middle East, all against the backdrop, and John will enjoy this, of the environmental catastrophe, which is countries that do not have water. And a significant amount of them exist in the Middle East. And that is the backdrop to the story. Elif, tell me, first of all, where did you come up with the characters? Maybe give the listeners a sense of the three characters and then the backdrop of the economics, the politics, etc. behind it.
Yes, I really appreciate this. So this is a story of three characters who seem to be completely different at first glance, but they are connected, hopefully in a surprising way for the readers. And then two rivers, which are the River Thames and the River Tigris or Tigris in the Middle East, and one ancient poem, which is the Epic of Gilgamesh. So three, two, one, and everything is connected via a tiny single drop of water. And even though it might look like an epic novel in the sense that it does span, a broad swathe of history, it does travel across cultures, continents, and centuries. But actually, everything came to me via that tiny little raindrop that one day landed on my palm, and I kept thinking, almost like a mystical question, can I see a whole world? Can I see the universe inside this? It's the very question that William Blake asked about a grain of sand. So that's how everything began. And if I may quickly add this, I think water is still one of the biggest mysteries in our lives. Today, when we talk about climate crisis, we are primarily talking about freshwater scarcity. Sometimes in Europe, we forget this, understandably, because of flash floods and so on. Sea levels are, of course, rising all across the world. But the paradox is, amidst this abundance of water, there isn't enough water to drink. And for those of us coming from the Middle East, this is not a hypothetical, question. It is an acute reality. Out of the most water-stressed 10 nations in the world, 7 are in the Middle East and in North Africa. So our rivers are dying, our rivers are drying up. And I think I wanted to see this entire novel like a love letter to a single drop of water.
Well, I mean, a love letter, an epic, a storytelling act of genius. You start with a raindrop falling on the head of what to most Europeans, and certainly I'd say most Irish people, is an obscure name of a king of the Assyrian regime, going all the way back to the sort of Sumerian, post-Sumerian times. And we end up in London of 2014. We go through the massacre of the Yazidi population in Iraq by ISIS. I mean, it's an amazing book. I mean, again, I just say to listeners, just read it. Just go out there, get it, read it. It's a wonderful act of storytelling, but it is an act, right? This is not a passive book. It's an activist book, and it makes you think about the world. Can you explain to me and to the listeners, what does water stress actually mean in real life for these hundreds of millions of people in the Middle East.
Unfortunately, I don't think it's an extreme product of my imagination to think that we might be witnessing water wars in the near future, because there
Yeah.
isn't enough water. And this is becoming more and more scarce with very dire consequences for everyone, but particularly for women, for minorities, and for the poor. They are the ones who will be affected more deeply from this lack of water. I I think all around the world, women are usually water carriers, young women, when there's no water nearby, they have to walk longer distances, unfortunately, increasing the possibility for gender violence. So, all I'm trying to say is in our heads, in our minds, we tend to put these things in different boxes. Here's the box for climate crisis. Here's the box for fresh water scarcity. This is the box for racial inequality or gender violence. But in reality, everything is interconnected, and water reminds us of this.
Well, I mean, again, I mean, the interesting thing is water is power because water is life, and he who controls life and the energy is the powerful one. And that's central to the story of the Yazidi girl. I'm not going to give away any secrets, is a dam that was being built in Turkey. And that dam would have therefore flooded very ancient lands, which were Yazidi lands in effect. Can you just tell me about that part of the story before we go on? I mean, talk about modern Turkey, and we might broaden it out into the world that we are living in, and you are trying to make sense of, Elif.
So the three characters in this book, and if we get a chance, I'd love to tell a few things about perhaps each.
Please do.
Yeah, one of them is a water scientist living in modern day London. She does study water, but she also studies buried rivers. As you know, the biggest rivers in our lives on our planet are invisible rivers, atmospheric rivers we have above our heads, but also so many buried and lost rivers, which is also an important metaphor for a storyteller. What else is buried in our lives? What other truths are buried in our communities? Then we have a Victorian era genius, if I may call him that, who is loosely inspired by a real life character, George Smith. This is the man who decoded the flood tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And this created a massive debate between science and religion at the time. He came to the Middle East in order to find the missing lines in the poem. He lost his life there, and today he's buried between Turkey and Syria in a forgotten graveyard. And I think a part of me wanted to honor this man. Had he been born today, I think we would have respected the neurodivergence of his mind, the beauty of his brain. But of course, at the time, born into severe poverty, he gets no recognition whatsoever. And it's purely with the power of his visual memory that he starts piecing together these shards of, clay tablets that go all the way back to thousands of years ago, uh, to the time of King
Yeah.
Ashurbanipal and the lost civilization. My third character, as you pointed out, is a little Yazidi girl. Now, as you know, the Yazidis are one of the most persecuted, maligned, misunderstood minorities in the world. Unfortunately, they've been called all kinds of names. They've been called devil worshippers by people who have no clue, no knowledge of the beauty of this culture. And so they're very vulnerable in that regard. This is a culture in which identity and memory is passed via oral storytelling rather than a written book. They do not have a written book. So it's the elderly who holds the memory. And at the beginning of my book, we see this little girl and the grandmother living in a place called Hasan Keyf in Turkey. The old name is Castrum Kefa. This is a settlement that's 12,000 years old.
Wow.
Immense importance it has for archaeologists, for historians, but also in terms of biodiversity. If you want to go to this place today in Turkey, you will not find it because it is inundated. It is flooded with water. The government insisted on building a dam exactly in that spot at the expense of the displacement of so many families. Even though many climate activists said, do not build it here, they built it there. And this dam has the lifespan of 50 years, 50. So for a dam that will last for 50 years, you're destroying 12,000-year-old history. That is how the story begins.
Well, it's an amazing story, but again, those kind of acts of kind of wanton environmental vandalism, we see them all the time. We see them all the time. They're made more acute in the Middle East because of the fractious nature of the ethnic background, of the autocratic nature, usually of the decisions, and of the inability of the people to have any real avenue to respond in any sort of democratic way to try and stop things. But I mean, again, as I say, the book takes three stories, but what it actually does, it tells a universal story of the modern world. And that's what I love about all your work. And you mentioned there, and I think it's very important, sort of a leaping point, the difference between Arthur Smith, who translated the Epic of Gilgamesh, and because he translated the Epic of Gilgamesh, people said, hold on a second, Gilgamesh was written 2,000 years before the Bible. And in Gilgamesh was the story of the Great Flood. Now, we decided that the story of the Great Flood was our leaping off point, and it was a story given by God. But if it actually had happened prior to God saying, well, then maybe God didn't write the Bible. That's the sort of the Victorian science versus religion idea. But science versus religion is still a monumental issue in the Middle East. Can you explain to me, from your position as a Turkish woman, but a cosmopolitan woman, what happened in Turkey with this science versus religion fight? Where is it taking us? And what is maybe the history, but also the literature of Turkey tell us about what's going on with maybe Trump's world as well? Because these are two pretty autocratic men at the top of what was a vibrant democracy and may well still be a vibrant democracy, but a democracy, particularly in the United States, that's definitely under threat.
Yes, these are very turbulent times for the entire world. I think, if I may take you back in time a little bit, late 1990s, early 2000s, the noughties, there was this idea that some parts of the world were solid and safe and steady. The Western world, you didn't have to worry about human rights, you didn't have to worry about LGBTQ plus rights or the future of our democracies or freedom of speech if you lived in the West. But you would have to worry about such things over there in those liquid lands. And I think what happened after 2016, after Brexit happened, after Trump happened, and we've seen also a rise of populist movements across continental Europe, where we are right now, we realize more and more that there is no such thing as solid lands versus liquid lands. In fact, we're all going through liquid times. What I'm trying to say is what happens in one country can easily happen also in another part of the world. We cannot be complacent about our own democracies. We all need to worry. We all need to get engaged. Now, Turkey is a very, very interesting case in that regard. It's a beautiful country with beautiful people, very complicated, but at the same time, it has been going backwards, at first gradually, but then with a bewildering speed. We need to remind ourselves that Turkey has relatively regular and relatively free elections. It has had until this point. So my point is to have a ballot box, as much as I respect elections, to have a ballot box in itself is not enough to sustain a democracy. In addition to the ballot box, in addition to the elections, you need rule of law, you need separation of powers, definitely a diverse, independent media, independent academia, women's rights, minority rights, together with all those components, plus the ballot box, a democracy can thrive and survive. What happened in Turkey was all the institutions and norms were broken one by one, and we only had the ballot box left. And recently, even that is now in danger because the mayor of Istanbul, who's very charismatic, very, very popular, very widely loved in the society, just days before he was about to announce his presidential nomination, thus becoming a rival to the president, just days before that, his diploma was suddenly revoked, cancelled, and he was put in jail. The people he works with in the municipality have all been arrested. Among them are cultural figures, people who have worked so hard for the cultural and art life of Istanbul. So it's an unacceptable, unlawful, and undemocratic situation. Many people, as you know, have been demonstrating on the streets. Most of them are young people and women. In that regard, there's always hope, when you look at the Turkish civil society. But to be honest, when you look at the politics and politicians in Turkey, it is quite demoralizing.
Now, what you've said there about Turkey, and you said that, that basically movements in certain countries almost can spread almost like a virus to other countries. And what becomes unthinkable yesterday becomes kind of acceptable today. And what becomes, acceptable today becomes, let's say, fantasy tomorrow. When this is the process whereby institutions, as you say, and you've described it interestingly, between solid and liquid. So the liquid countries are the countries that are amorphous, ephemeral, that we would have regarded as being unstable. And you're saying that instability is beginning to permeate. When you see what's happening in the United States, because you talked about academia there, you talked about the press there, you talked about the rule of law, when the Supreme Court is ignored in the United States. Is this what you're saying? Is this what you said? I saw this type of stuff in Turkey, or is that too dramatic a comparison?
There are echoes. Of course, it's not exactly the same thing. Each and every country has its own unique characteristics. So sometimes it doesn't help to lump together every example in one basket or under one category. However, we cannot be extremely confident that time is always linear and progressive. That is an illusion of our minds. We like to think that tomorrow will be more developed than yesterday. We like to believe that the arc of history will bend towards justice. And it is a good way of maybe thinking, hopeful way of thinking, but we need to be careful because in reality, there is no such guarantee. Countries can go backwards. So my point is, and we focus too much on Trump because of every day he says something that, so much of our media and civil society attention goes into, but we need to, I think, pay much more attention to democratic norms and institutions and language. When that language gets broken, as I'm a writer, I'm a novelist. For me, words are so important. Even in the UK, we've seen this. When opponents become enemies, when
Yes.
judges become enemies of the people, that kind of rhetoric is so dangerous. We might have disagreements, but we also need to be aware of our shared values. And those shared values need to be around democracy and pluralism and diversity and rule of law. Everybody's in need of, a good functioning rule of law. So I think it all comes back to how do we sustain the norms? How do we sustain the language, the institutions, even in a place like America? I mean, I think the book bans and book removals are a prime example of this. It is alarming the speed with which things can go backwards and democracy can be weakened.
And there's one thing, I think all our listeners will identify with all or bits of what you've said. But there's one thing that you've framed, which I've always loved the way you frame things. You talked about the age of anxiety. I read a piece you wrote autumn of last year about the difference between knowledge and wisdom, and the notion that we have lots and lots of knowledge because everything's at our fingertips now. It's a broader point about the way in which we communicate, the role of the internet, etc. And you're saying we're living in an age of anxiety. What did you mean by that?
Again, we're old enough to remember there was so much optimism once upon a time, and the biggest optimists were techno optimists. They would tell us that this was the age of information, this extreme romanticization of information. And they would tell us that if you spread information thanks to Facebook or digital technologies, everyone was going to become informed, and informed people would make informed decisions. Thus, democracy would spread almost spontaneously all across the globe. And this was the triumph of liberal democracy. Fast forward, that did not happen at all. Where we have ended up is this is an age in which we are bombarded by snippets of information, morsels of information. So there's way too much information. And the truth is, we cannot process it. Our brains are not wired like that. So what we do every day is we just scroll up and down. We learn maybe tidbits, some little segments about what happened in Afghanistan, what happens in Gaza, what happened in Ukraine, but without processing what we're seeing, we move on to the next snippet of information. And that is not helping anyone, and it's not helping us ourselves either. What it does is it makes us tired, demoralized, and then little by little numbness sets in. And I'm very, very worried about apathy. This is the age of anxiety. I think everyone is worried right now, young and old, East and West. The only difference is some people hide their anxieties more than others. But if it were to decline into a world of apathy, I think it would be a much more dangerous world to live in. The moment we say, what's happening in Afghanistan is none of my business, what's going on in Ukraine, in Sudan, in Gaza, or just next door, none of my business, that kind of numbness is a very, very dangerous thing. So, coming back to our question about information, I think we would do ourselves a lot of good if we stayed away from these morsels of information and then try to focus instead on knowledge and wisdom. This is an age in which we have too much information, but little knowledge and even less wisdom. Now, how do we increase knowledge? First of all, knowledge cannot be rushed. We need to slow down. We need slow journalism. Definitely podcasts. Podcasts are amazing, because it's longer conversations. And then we need in-depth analysis. We need cultural festivals like the beautiful Dolki, festival where people hear each other, and there's calmness and there's nuance. And then we need more wisdom. I think for wisdom, in addition to intellectual or cerebral analysis, we have to bring the heart into the conversation because wisdom requires compassion. Wisdom requires empathy. It's almost like a spiritual journey. You put yourselves in the shoes of another person, and that's humbling for the soul. So my point is, how do we increase knowledge? How do we increase wisdom? But let us spend less and less time with these, bits and pieces of information, which is not helping us at all.
Elif, I think we could definitely talk all, and we will at Talkie all day. But I think that lovely sort of exit point of how do you cultivate knowledge, wisdom? The obvious answer to me is reading and books
Yeah.
and listening to music and things that actually slow things down. In terms of, this is a final question to the pair of us because we also earn our living as writers. What do you think is threatened by the incessant acceleration of information, particularly when it takes years to sit down and write a book? Do you think that our business of being writers, will gradually become a sort of a curiosity, or do you think there will be a sort of a resurgence?
Yeah. There are so many challenges, David, as you so eloquently underlined, from AI. Also, we touched upon briefly the book removals, book bans, in an age in which everything of fast consumption, instant gratification and hyper information. I think there is a danger, of course. Who you might say, who has the time to just sit down and read? But something interesting is happening, and I think we need to see that too. You might remember there were all these predictions that the novel was dead. I
Yes.
read articles in 1980s saying the novel cannot survive. 1990s, early 2000s. This is a zombie genre. How many times the novel has died? And yet, when you look at what's going on in reality, and every publisher will tell you this, people are reading fiction. That is very interesting. In an age of such speed and chaos, I think the opposite is also happening. The deeper our need for the ancient art of storytelling. So we see a rise in book clubs, we see a rise in reading parties among young people. I personally see more and more young people and young men coming to literary events and asking questions and being engaged. So we need to see that as well. And I do not think the art of storytelling will disappear anytime soon. It is just as essential and existential as our need for water and air. If I may quickly add this, we started with the Epic of Gilgamesh, this
Yes.
conversation. Just imagine, David, this was told from one generation to another, grandmothers to grandchildren, thousands and thousands of years ago, before it was written down on clay tablets by scribes. So it's actually much older than we know. And ever since this poem, this long narrative was imagined, so many empires have come and gone. So many strong men, mighty kings have perished. Even the tallest monuments have crumbled to dust. But here we are, thousands of years later, we're still talking about a poem which is made of breath and made of words. It has survived the tides of history. So my point is literature has a very deep but gentle resilience. And we should also remember that.
Elif Shafak, I can't wait to see you in Dalkey in a couple of weeks' time, but such a Beautiful conversation. In fact, we have a book club as part of the David McWilliams podcast. Now, typically we do economics books, but you know what we might do if you're into it? We might pick an Elif Shafak book over the course of the next month or two. We will get our book club to read it. And maybe if you have time, you might come on and we can do a sort of a one-to-many chat about it.
That would be an immense pleasure. I would love that. Yes.
Great. Well, let's do it. Let's do it. Elif, listen, we will see you in a couple of weeks' time. As always, an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. And let's work on the book club idea behind the scenes.
I'm so looking forward and I'm very grateful. Thank you for every word. I enjoyed this conversation so much. Can't wait to see you in beautiful Dalkey.
Great stuff, Elif. See you then.
Elif is such a beautiful writer, and the way she kind of put everything there was amazing. But what I was really interested in is her whole idea of water, and of course it's been fundamental to life itself, but with the likes of climate change, it's also the source, and increasingly so, of conflict and battle and war, particularly in the Middle East where it's so scarce.
Well, completely. And I mean, many people would argue that part of, for example, if you look at Israel and Palestine and the diversion of the Red Sea and the Sea of Galilee and all the River Jordan, all that sort of stuff, because basically most wars, the casus belli, as the Romans used to say. Do you like that, Johnny? Bit of Latin there,
Casus
right?
belli.
The source of the war it's always resources, right?
Yeah.
It's resources. Those resources could be energy, they could be wealth, they could be riches, they could be food, they could be water. I mean, at its elemental stage, and I mean, if you talk to Chinese and Indian scholars and commentators, they'll say that the Himalayas is an epicenter of
Yes, it is.
Potential war between China and India, because the entire Ganges Delta is basically, and that is the most populous, one of the most populous parts of the world, is basically made livable by the snows from the Himalayas.
And did you know that there's one mountain in particular there, Mount Kailash, where 4 of the major Asian rivers spring from?
Well, see, there you go. So I mean, and again, they're having bizarre fights with cudgels up there, the
Yes,
Indians
they
and the
are,
Chinese.
yeah.
But to go back to Elif's point, which is, and I think it's a beautiful point to make, which is that we need a new way of communicating. And the new way, John, is the old way. It's taken time.
Yes.
It's not necessarily rushing. It's turning off the phone, etc., and saying, okay, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to try and become not just knowledgeable, which is a head full of facts, but a head full of facts that can join up the dots and actually can refer back to history.
That's
this
the key thing. Yeah.
And all that sort of stuff. So I suppose it is, again, on the week that we launched the Book Festival Talk, it's kind of in praise of that contemplative, sitting around, reading a book, taking it handy, and being promiscuous in your tastes, reading a bit of fiction, non-fiction, history, mathematics, economics, all that sort of thing.
I loved what she was saying when she was talking about the tech optimists, because I'm a bit tired of that myself, where like tech will solve everything. But, this supposed idea of the democratization of knowledge. But, there is, as you were saying, there a massive difference between information and knowledge. And then when we're being flooded relentlessly with clips from TikTok, etc., we become overwhelmed by facts without the understanding. And therefore, as she was saying, it can lead to apathy.
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right, John. I mean, let me leave on this image. It is the intellectual equivalent of a Big Mac. It is fast food for the brain.
Yes.
That it basically satisfies you initially, and then within a couple of hours or even less in certain cases, you're back to the well, right? Because it's actually just flim-flam. So that's it, the intellectual equivalent of the Big Mac. We will leave it there, Johnny boy, and I will talk to you Tuesday.